Linda Birnbaum is the former director of the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences and the National Toxicology Program. After retirement, she was granted Scientist Emeritus status and still maintains a laboratory. As a board-certified toxicologist, Dr. Birnbaum served as a federal scientist for 40 years. Prior to her appointment as NIEHS director in 2009, she spent 19 years at the EPA, where she directed the largest division focusing on environmental health research. Welcome, Linda, and thank you for starting us off.
Let's see, trying to screen share. Okay, very good. Well, I'm really honored to be able to participate in this symposium, and really what I'm been asked to do is give you a very, very quick, brief overview of the problems that we have with PFAS. I don't think I'm speaking to a totally naive group, but I think it is important that we all understand what the whole issues are. So one of the things that I'm not sure everyone is aware of how many PFAS they are. Everybody's heard of the ones on the right on your screen, the PFOS and the PFOA, which are the ones really that we have the most data about. But according to EPA's Office of Research Development, they list over 12,000 different PFAS chemicals. Some are products, some are impurities, and some are the results of environmental or biological degradation. The critical thing about all PFAS, obviously, are the fact that you've got lots of fluorines on carbon atoms. The carbon-fluorine bond is probably the strongest bond that, or almost the strongest bond that we know of that exists. It barely does exist in nature. All of the PFAS are synthetic chemicals. Most of the PFAS, we really don't even know where they are and what they are. So why do we have these compounds? Well, they're very useful. They provide resistance to grease, water, and oil. They're used extensively as surfactants and stain repellents, and they have been used historically, starting in the 1960s, for suppression of oil and grease and petroleum-based fires. Some of the problems I mentioned, that carbon-fluorine bond is so strong that it's almost impossible to break. Therefore, they are extremely persistent, all of them, in the environment. Many of them are highly mobile in the environment. We know that the Arctic is highly contaminated, and many of them are bioaccumulative. Now, we're beginning to see short-chain alternatives since 3M agreed or announced in 1998 that these PFOS and PFOA were found in the blood of the general population. Industry began to shift to short-chain alternatives, and PFMOAA and Genix are two examples of ether linkages. We have very limited data on the thousands of short chains, but the small number that have been studied seem to have the same effects as we see with the long chains. So how are we exposed to these compounds? Well, again, I mentioned that they were first began to be used in AFFF in, say, the 1960s, but they've been really used in industry and consumer products since the 1950s. Much of our concern, or historical concern, has focused on their presence in drinking water as contamination, can also be in groundwater as well. But they are in a huge number of different kind of consumer uses. I've mentioned the AFFF, but they're in cosmetics, they're in your pots and pans, they're in your clothing, they're on your carpet. Unfortunately, they're on food packaging and food. They are pretty much everywhere. And I should say we are all exposed. We now know there are over 200 different use categories of PFAS. And we are exposed to these. Ingestion is probably the major route, assuming that you are not living right near a production or a use facility, but in which case inhalation or dermal can become important. And the ingestion is drinking water, food, and dust, not only for toddlers, but for adults as well. Next, whoops, I'm doing the slides. So there's a really wide variety of health effects of PFOS and PFOA. Those are the two, as I said, most studied compounds. What we are seeing is testicular and kidney cancer, although there's often also some evidence, I should say, building for bladder cancer, prostate cancer, ovarian cancer, and breast cancer. There are effects on the immune system, not only ulcerative colitis, but also suppression, which is ulcerative colitis is a autoimmune disease, but also suppression of the primary immune response, and that's been observed with child and vaccine responses. High cholesterol has been reported in many, many different studies. Pregnancy-induced hypertension, impacts on our thyroid system, but also now we're finding changes in some of our estrogenic and androgenic systems, as well as others. Evidence for liver malfunctioning is mounting, and there are associations, maybe in part related to the liver malfunction and the high cholesterol, for obesity. Some other things that have been reported are lower birth weight and size for infants whose mothers have higher levels of exposure. Delays in puberty, decreases in fertility and early menopause, and I've mentioned some of the effects on our hormone systems as well. So I would say PFAS are multi-system toxicants. You pretty much give me an organ system, and there will be data from animals and emerging data from observational human studies showing effects on pretty much any organ you can look at. So I mentioned effects on the thyroid that have been reported, multiple effects on the immune system, even some evidence for things like asthma, impacts on the liver and liver function, impacts on the pancreas. Actually, cancer has been reported in experimental animals. And there is some suggestion of cancer death in some of the worker populations. Kidney, it's not only kidney cancer, it's also kidney malfunction. I mentioned cancer in multiple tissues, evidence for effects on the reproductive organs, and growing evidence, although still not consistent, on neurodevelopment. So the question is, this environmental persistence is a huge problem. The PFAS do not degrade, at least the terminal PFAS. And I say that because you will frequently hear, well, the PFAS that are being used today are things like the fluorotelomers, and they, can degrade, or they can degrade to things like PFOA and PFOS. The final products do not degrade further. And all of these things pass through our wastewater treatment plants. So this is just a very detailed slide looking at some of the different things and the different places that these get through our wastewater treatment plants and how they get back. I live in North Carolina, and not far from me, we have a small town whose entire municipal water supply is contaminated because of what's coming from the wastewater treatment plant upstream, about 20 miles upstream of them. So how do we get rid of it from water? I mean, this is a major issue, and we're not terribly successful. Granular activated carbon works pretty well for the long chain PFAS, things like PFOA and PFOS. It does not work well for the short chains, and the same thing can be said for anion exchange resins. There are approaches using nanofiltration or reverse osmosis, which work quite well for both long and short chains, but they require a lot of energy. And in all cases, whether it's the GAC or say the reverse osmosis, what do you do with a concentrate that comes out the other end? So EPA, in about a year and a half ago, put out some interim guidance looking at technologies for the destruction and disposal of PFAS and PFAS-containing materials, and they broke it down into basically 3 classes: thermal treatment, landfilling, and underground injection. And the considerations really are kind of the types of treatments, control devices, and what are the emissions that come out. And I think it's a huge issue, especially when you're dealing with landfilling and the thermal treatment. And you got to keep testing and monitoring any of these things, and the uncertainties are pretty tremendous at this point. So this is just a table from that a recent paper that came out looking at thermal treatments and technologies. None of this is complete. I think the answer is these are almost all laboratory kinds of studies where you could look at, for example, incineration or pyrolysis and gasification. The problem is none of these have really been shown to work in the real world and under real world conditions. And again, as I mentioned before, what is released when you, for example, burn these things? This is just, I thought, a nice diagram looking at kind of the issues of the gas extraction wells and where you could inject it potentially, although I think you always have to be worried about the leachate and discharge into the water when you do a deep well injection. And the third is, for example, looking at different kinds of, this is kind of an overview of different kinds of disposal and destruction technologies for PFAS. And I think at this point, we still don't have good ways to do this. And I think with that, I'll be ending and say, why do we still make compounds that'll never go away? Why didn't we learn from DDE, dioxins, PCBs, brominated flame retardants, etc.? Unless we finally start turning off the tap, not only are we exposed, but our children, our grandchildren, and beyond that.